Welcome to Flying a False Flag, Advanced C2, Trust Conflicts, and Domain Takeover. We're in the Jasmine room, and the speaker is Nick Landers. A couple of notes before we begin. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside and Shoreline ballrooms on level 2 during the day, and for the welcome reception at 5:30 tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is in the business hall on level 2. Also, join us for the Pony Awards in Lagoon JK&L at 6:30 p.m. Please put your cell phones on silent. Make sure that you're not disturbing your neighbors. And if you have questions at the end, please make sure that you use the microphones that are located on either side here and here. With that, I want to go ahead and invite Nick up to the stage. Thank you. Good job.
Thanks, appreciate it. Thank you guys, that was really nice. This is my first Black Hat talk. You'll have to forgive me for any nervousness, but first I want to start by introducing myself. So classic bio page, some might recognize me from Twitter. I have the scared looking owl or whatever emotion it's showing. I'm a technical lead at Silent Break Security. You can find us up at the front row in black. I do primarily research and development, offensive operations with a focus. I do a lot of consulting as well. So this presentation is really going to be centered around, the offensive applications of C2 and sort of taking that a little bit further than it has before. Some might recognize our Dark Side Ops training, which we give at Black Hat every year, or the Shellcode RDI project or Red Team Toolkit. So I'll start with a quick agenda. We'll begin with some C2 methodology and channels concepts. So we're just going to kind of get everybody caught up to, what do I mean when I say command and control and where are we at now? Following that, we'll tackle some trust conflicts and discuss that. And then cloud abuse and takeover, so the death of the IP, sort of the transition that we're making into that realm. And then we'll close up with some final thoughts and hopefully some questions if I can talk fast enough. So first, command and control. And at heart, I'm actually a software developer. I don't like fixing code or debugging it much, so that's why I write malware instead of software. But in a software model, the concepts of command and control exist, and have existed for a really long time. You have a client and a server with some channel between them and usually a perimeter boundary that you're crossing. So part of that includes channel selection, the redundancy of the server endpoints. They might worry about obfuscation to protect IP or serialization, encryption, and the trust of the server itself. Now what's interesting is we oftentimes feel isolated in our realm, but all of these problems are not unique to malware either. We struggle with the same qualities. We have to worry about serialization and encryption and trust. So you can effectively think of an implant or military jargon as a listening post, or LP as you'll hear me refer to it as a client and server. There's really no difference between them. And before I go any further, I want to also define what I mean when I talk about C2. It's a broad concept and it expands everything from, the agent and the commands you execute, the functionality it has, and the transits that you use. But generally, when I talk about C2, I'm talking about the 3 primary layers where you're taking some binary data, transiting across a network boundary, and then deserializing it on the far side. And further, I think we can break this down into 2 larger concepts. One is C2 is a technique, which is a strategy of execution. So that's like any other strategy. We have, a particular methodology we apply to our C2. The second one is the channel. So that's the medium that we work across. That could be TCP or UDP. We'll talk about a bunch of them throughout the slides. And to start, I want to begin with the technique. So this is our strategy. And this covers a lot of concepts. I'm going to diagram this out on sort of an implant and LP relationship. And first we'll talk about orientation. So, when we think about C2, we can think about a reverse shell or a bind shell as it's commonly referred to, where the operator is connecting back into the implant. Those both have to do with the strategy of our C2. In practice, this looks like port knocking, web shells, bind shells, all of the classic, I compromised a web server and I'm sending it a command in real time. This is extremely efficient and it has benefits with attribution because when we are a client, we can obfuscate our true identity a little bit easier than we can with a server. It's a bit conditional though. You can't always use things like, web shells on assessments where there's NAT or firewall rules enabled. So usually we resort to the opposite, where it's a reverse shell, and we have to deal with things like intervals. So, the beaconing process that an agent might do, or alternatively the classic, shell in quotes term, where we open up a socket and we transit data back and forth over the same socket. Beaconing is very traditional, particularly in red teaming. We have stuff like Cobalt Strike, where you have an interval time that decides how quickly you can take action. So I like to call this concept action delay. Nice part about beaconing is it's simple and consistent, so it's really easy to code, and we always have an expectation for when an agent is going to call back to us. We obviously have the disadvantage of it being inefficient, and we get dry beacons that aren't doing anything, so the agent is just checking in with us. And we're always making this trade-off between setting a really short beaconing time to reduce action delay, or setting a really long beaconing time to improve stealth. A slight alternative to this would be something like long polling, which I don't necessarily see all that often in offensive malware. This is where you sort of blend the responsiveness of a classic beaconing system with the stealth of, sort of long-term beaconing. So a connection is made from a victim to a server, and the server doesn't have to reply immediately. This concept is applied to web all the time. We simply hold the thread open for some period of time and serve tasks back down when the operator decides to actually type them in. Assuming we reach some, 30-second or 45-second interval, we're probably going to let the connection reset anyways. This is also because gateways who might man in the middle of the connection would cause us issues in that situation. Distribution is another quality. For anybody who's set up red team infrastructure, you're working with usually multiple servers with some sort of round robin system. And you usually have a failover system, so if domains can't be accessed because of perimeter controls, or they can't be accessed because of you buying a cheap VPS, which we've had happen plenty of times, hopefully you have at least one connection that's successful. Then the last concept is routing, which introduces some really complex strategies, one being you pushing traffic through a third party, and your orientation maintains that an implant is shoveling data to a listening post. You can also blend this with distribution, and this is the classic red team setup where we have bastion hosts. We're not interested in loading our tools onto lots of servers on the web. We load them onto a single server in a backend, and we distribute bastions across the web to collect traffic. You can invert this same strategy, blending sort of that orientation and routing piece to get sort of what I like to call a dead drop system. So this is where you have some third-party application, and there's a client agent checking for tasking against that third party, and an attacker can plant callback data into that service, and the agent can pull it back and push results. So this improves our stealth wildly. Obviously, the third party becomes the only thing that most defenders would see in terms of perimeter defenses. But it also introduces a lot of complexity for our code and an action delay that's at least n times 2 in terms of what a traditional request round trip would be to that third party, because we have to place data there and then have another agent come and retrieve data from there. All right, so abstract stuff out of the way. Let's get to sort of the second half of our formula and talk about some basic channels and some of the popular ones. For anybody who's familiar with maybe modern malware samples, sockets are still surprisingly popular, which is funny because I don't think red teamers use them all that often. They're responsive and simple, which have huge advantages for us. And you can imagine in this scenario, an implant is just posting back some host data to a server. We might add encryption to that to help improve the stealth or the trackability. We also might add SSL, a bit unnecessarily considering we just added encryption, but we might do this to blend in with other protocols that use SSL as well. We could also add chunking to reduce the total volume of any single request. At the end of the day, though, any observer will, one, probably look at the destination of the traffic and assess the fact that that destination either isn't trusted or is unknown. Two, they could look at the protocol, or other words, lack thereof, and say, well, this traffic isn't trusted because it's unknown in terms of the style or the actual content. 2 or 3 would be the volume. So in total, regardless of how many requests we send, can this be detected? This is common in detecting DNS traffic. DNS traffic is super stealthy until you need to get volume out of it. And then it falls apart because DNS just isn't good at carrying large volume. And the lastly would be perimeter controls. So, our implant just might not be able to communicate, or a defender might set up a perimeter control that blocks a particular port or protocol and port combination. From this, we can start to extract attacker priorities when it comes to C2. So the first one is trust, and we talk about this a lot. Usually we're referring to trust repositories where we look at categorization or blacklists. We want to avoid being blacklisted while being categorized as good as we can. There are also takeover primitives and piggybacking that come in play here. So if we can piggyback off of traffic or domains that are already trusted, then we don't have to gain that trust ourselves, which is pretty big. 2 would be our content. So we are interested in making our content match what's expected for a particular traffic signature. This is like the character set, the frequency, the pure volume of that. And lastly, the vectors, so the protocol, the port, and there are these like abstraction details that start to occur on top of that. You think of like DNS over HTTP. That's technically HTTP traffic, but now we have an entirely new protocol being implemented on top of it. It's almost like an entirely new layer to our model. We also have orientation, structure, and then just the limitations of what that particular method looks like. So we might not be able to pack data past a certain size. We might have to encode it in a specific way. And it's with this that comp size strikes back, and we return to the OSI model, which I've gone ahead and taken the bottom 2 layers off. And we can start to think about how defenses are implemented against this model, whereby there's coverage against any particular horizontal set of this model. So if you don't have a layer 7 firewall, you're not getting any insight into anything past TCP traffic. There's also a vertical piece to this as well, where you can think of you having insight into TCP and UDP, but you allowing ICMP completely. Those technically exist at the same layer, but your layer 7 firewall doesn't mean anything if it can't analyze a particular layer beneath it. And then, like I said, I think there's becoming this higher layer, like a layer 8. I've played with the name cloud layer, but I'm sure that the review boards wouldn't go for that. But it's these abstractions that are on top of protocols where like HTTP is being used to do all sorts of nonsense now. So breaking this down, kind of diving into each of them, HTTP is super common in malicious tooling. We usually have some sort of request where we're base64 encoding data. It's extremely common at the perimeter, which is great for us. It's layered on TCP, which means we get great reliability. It has complex dialect and usage. This is probably something most people don't think about. It's the fact that encoded binary data or mass amounts of binary data that have been encoded is not rare in HTTP. That's extremely common. HTTP is used for all sorts of stuff, so we can blend in easily even if we look really obscure. It's also well supported in languages, which as a developer is a huge piece for me. One of the big reasons people don't build the crazy C2 systems that you can think of in your head is because nobody wants to figure out how to build an HTTP2 library by themselves or a WebSockets integration. So beefing this up, we're trying to masquerade our content a little more. We'll probably switch the request to maybe a post request. There are trade-offs here, but we're interested in maybe getting our callback data out of web logs. We might use sensitive domains like medical or banking domains to avoid the fact that the domain would get logged at all or the traffic would get logged at all. And we might embed ourselves in special headers like the authenticate header, which are explicitly denied analysis because of the sensitive data that they carry. So there are all these nuances to the protocol, and really what I'm getting at is when you think about a layer 7 firewall, you think about, oh, it can detect HTTP traffic. But what about HTTP traffic can it detect inside, or can it extract from HTTP? Can it extract particular interesting headers, or can it know the difference between a fake masquerading domain or a real medical domain? Pushing this further, the domain itself, besides malware.com, probably want to get categorized. We could purchase expired domains. This is a common thing for anybody who's not familiar with it. In fact, there are some amazing tools that have been released that effectively look at the categorization of any given domain. There are a bunch of providers, and really the trust repository is somewhat combined. I get questions a lot like, well, if I knew exactly what trust provider a client was using, would I just submit the domain to that provider? But the idea is we're collecting these domains for the long term. So if we're using HTTP, that domain name is sort of everything, and the trust we have with it is everything. So part of what we talk about is keeping them and holding them and really building them up in the eyes of all of these trust repositories. And once again, I mentioned some great automated tooling like Domain Check or Chameleon for analyzing the status of a particular domain or tracking them long term. Also, some of the SpectreOps guys just released a platform management tool that does some similar work. Pushing it even further than that, if anybody's ever heard of HTTP pipelining, it's this idea that we might shovel multiple HTTP requests down a single socket without waiting for a response. So this has been looked at to effectively create or push forward a benign request in front of your callback data. There's an interesting blog that talks about this as an alternative to domain fronting, and it's something I think worth thinking about. Past that, WebSockets, there are some great integrations for Cobalt Strike, external C2. And once again, here we're aiming for less inspection in terms of trust. So we gain trust by the fact that nobody's checking our traffic. It's kind of an inverted approach. And in terms of the vector, we add speed and sort of these push-pull systems, which really optimize our action delay. Remember, as an operator, I'm most interested in the tool matching my style of operating. So the C2 just becomes this big complexity that I have to deal with. If I had it my way, I would have the tool be async and effectively be connected to me all the time so I could run whatever I wanted on it. And then in a similar vein of WebSockets, HTTP2 is coming out. So if anybody has not thought of that in terms of malware or malicious use, you definitely should. Once again, less inspection here. Transfer size reductions. Encoding is a big part of HTTP C2. It's what makes it so complex. So the fact that that protocol is moving to a binary standard really adds a lot of benefit for us as attackers. Merlin is a cool C2 framework that actually already uses and implements HTTP2 and Golang, so if you want to look at that. And it's with that I transitioned to the second, probably most popular layer 7 protocol, which is DNS. Also, you don't have to worry, we're not going to go through all these in case anybody was stressing out. So DNS, used most commonly to transfer data over links that you effectively don't have a direct access to. So DNS has this amazing property of I can push data to somebody's server and that packet will just sort of find its way to where it needs to be. This is a really neat property, and I think what makes DNS so popular for abuse, despite the fact that it's actually kind of a pain to use. It's really difficult, regardless of request type, to get decent data out. You can sometimes pull good data back, but usually you're working like sub KB in that realm. And even in that, it's really easy to detect just based on volume, name, length, or the fact that there's been some number of unique subdomains per particular top-level domain. If we wanted to improve this, we prefer a blended C2 approach. So we like to mix things like DNS with HTTP. So those beaconing systems, there were those dead beacons that are wasted on HTTP, are set and sort of well-groomed for DNS because we don't need them to transfer a lot of data. There's also DNS over HTTP, as I've mentioned before. We could look at implementing DNSSEC just to evade some stuff, or we could trade throughput for trusted net blocks. So, the fact that DNS resolution might get blocked because the IP belongs to a particular country's IP space. So we might effectively reduce the total of number of data we could transfer to just improve the reliability of it. And the last segue I want to make before we move into the good stuff is ICMP. This has actually been around forever, a bit like DNS. I think, once again, the complexities of implementing it maybe make people shy away, but there are samples in the wild that use this. One nice thing about like an echo request is you get arbitrary payload size, which once again, as a developer, is an important thing for me. We can effectively extract data and tack arbitrary data onto the packet without worrying about protocol syntax limitations, stuff like that. In terms of improvements, we could use alternate codes. So a lot of people use an echo request and reply, but that's not the only code that ICMP supports. In fact, time-exceeded messages are almost as popular and not as well monitored, although they can't transfer as much data. But like in a time-exceeded packet, you can easily get two 32-bit blocks, which is pretty decent. Smaller payloads with more volume is another strategy we employ, both with DNS and ICMP. So you'll have to make trade-offs there, and usually you're aiming for, maybe you might trade a higher packet volume for just smaller packets in general. Also, the fact that ICMP is connectionless means that you start pushing really large packets and you're just going to run into deliverability issues. And then lastly, I want to do a shout out to Sami Kamkar's project PwnNat, where he demonstrates a really neat way to discover IP addresses for a UDP NAT bypass, where effectively you have an agent behind a NAT firewall making a type 8 echo request out to a known IP address. And then at some point, a server requests in and responds to that echo request saying, hey, whatever that packet was, it never reached the server, the TTL was exceeded. The nice part is these are connectionless packets, but the NAT on the perimeter will let that packet in and back to the agent because it just assumes that it was a reply from a server trying to help out. I really recommend you go and look at his tools. The UDP NAT punch thing is an entirely different beast and really neat. All right, so with that, then we transition to trust conflicts. So we've covered a couple of basic protocols. I think HTTP, most people in here are familiar with that. DNS, maybe if you've used some advanced tooling or more advanced tooling. But now we're sort of going to move into the realm of HTTP layered on top of trusted assets. So there are a lot of different assets we might look at for this, and I kind of loosely group them into categories, although I'm sure these categories aren't entirely accurate. We might look at email assets or chat assets. These systems are generally dead drop, so if you remember talking about that, if we are going to abuse a trusted asset or use a third party, we're usually having some system where we drop data and pull that data back out on the far side. We get a lot of inherent stealth with this, obviously perimeter exclusion, SIM whitelisting, or just the fact that the domain's familiar to a particular analyst. These projects have been coming out for a long time, and as you guys will see, there's no shortage of examples of really cool third-party C2. So in terms of abuse, just in the social category, there's been a couple examples of people abusing Twitter. There's also been some nice multi-site. The Hammer Toss agent does some crazy stuff with like 3 or 4 different providers. And the social media C2 is a POC for a similar thing. I've obviously included links in the bottom of these slides for anybody, and they will be distributed, so don't stress out too much about it. Beyond that, chat, Slack, super popular thing. There's 3 projects out right now, and I'm sure more that are in private hands that effectively perform C2 over Slack agents. Once again, there's no shortage of sites that we could use to perform abuse. Really, what it comes down to is what does it take to implement that? So, we might trade the complexities of Slack for just the sheer benefit that Slack has high volumes of traffic, people chatting all day long. So just keep that in mind as you think about all of the opportunities for abusing these providers. In terms of email, there's GCAT and GDOG, which demonstrated that for Gmail. Did I say Gmail? Anyways, email, GCAT, GDOG, and then the light neuron compromise showed a lot of cool stuff for Exchange servers. So sort of poked the hole at using email for C2. They did some really neat stenography stuff. I highly recommend reading about it if you're interested. And it's with this that we reached sort of the first POC that I'm going to release. This is something I call Post Office. It's effectively a mail C2 proof of concept that runs over EWS. So it does account piggybacking. I got thinking about this idea that if you compromised an individual host, that user is going to have an Outlook box open, and they're effectively going to be doing email all day long. So if we were on the client side and we had code execution, we could effectively steal their credentials because many people store their Outlook credentials in the Windows Vault, or we could simply reuse NTLM auth using WinINet. And then we could post messages to the EWS endpoint and effectively send messages through their mailbox out to our server. The nice part about this is we're never actually contacting our own mail server, and we can do some neat things like hide our C2 data in X headers so that the message itself doesn't actually have any content in it that looks malicious. So we might still have to deal with spam filters. I'm implemented using SendGrid for this. I'm sure you could do it a bunch of different ways if you wanted to do SMTP yourself. I kind of preferred that just for the integration piece. But first, we land on a host, we pull endpoint settings and the credentials, and then we would configure an auto hide rule. So this is just prepping for the ultimate reply that we're going to get from the attacker box. We don't want that email to be loaded into the inbox. And then afterwards, we send an email, and we effectively put our C2 data in an email header. SendGrid parses it using an inbound webhook and forwards us the content. This whole process effectively runs in reverse. We would post the email back and have the agent use it. In terms of configuration, it's somewhat simple. SendGrid's rather nice. You can set up a subdomain on a particular trusted domain that you have configured and tell it any email that you receive here should be sent to http mypublicserver.com. And then the MX records are pretty simple as well. We just say any mail going to c2.thedarkside.io goes to the SendGrid servers. So I'll try to show a video here if you guys can see it. But effectively, I have the Visual Studio project. It's a C++ agent side, and I have the server loaded up. So the agent's effectively booting, and it's going to beacon back to the server. And the server's going to print out all the email data. But if we scroll down, effectively, it just says we loaded a new agent. So this is an agent like via email, and we're just going to tell it to exec a command. So we're just going to tell it to run whoami/all with like system. And you can see in the new window, this is it waiting, and it's continually checking the inbox. And it's got the tasking from the server, so it received the email, parsed the email, and then effectively returned the tasking. And you can see in our new shell, we got the output for the whoami command. Oh, sorry guys, closed up here. Man, even when you video your demos, they still don't go well. I really tried to prevent this. Yeah, probably. All right, where are we at? Is that good? Cool. So in terms of our additional items, operations, we have like SaaS services. MWR Labs has done a blog post about using Office 365 for C2. There's the Canisrufus, yeah, apologize for botching the name, for performing GitHub, and there's Google Drive as well. There's also a lot of internal C2 concepts, so Active Directory, it's been proven that we can do C2 via that. We can also do C2 via MS SQL. The PowerUp SQL project demonstrates a lot of neat stuff there. And the Outflank guys have also looked at external Cobalt Strike C2 for file server or file shares in sort of an isolated sense. And then some additional ones, Wikipedia, there's a project for that, and Pastebin, the AGA campaign abused Pastebin for transferring data. But what about trust repos? This is something I haven't seen a lot of. What if you wanted to get data in and out of a network using a repository that was dedicated to analyzing malware? So what I came up with is a project I'm calling Addendum, which is effectively a VirusTotal C2 project where it stuffs data into document properties and then uploads that document as a sample. VirusTotal is very kind about this because it wants samples and it will go ahead and parse that sample, although the analysis can take a while. And then when that sample is parsed, the metadata will be extracted and available on the response of the page, assuming you know the hash. So we track sample uploads using comments, and we handle large payloads, or it handles large payloads gracefully because of how much we can stuff in the particular properties. I think it's ideal for static stages or downloads. So if you were looking for something where you could preload a URL into an agent, and if it checked or bypassed a sandbox check, it could then go pull this item from VirusTotal. I think full-blown dynamic C2 is a little bit tricky, not just because the analysis time can take a while. But the diagram for this is one, we pack callback data into an Office doc, we upload it, and we effectively wait for the sample analysis to finish. Once it's done, we make a comment on that sample. The nice part is anybody who comes along and knows our username can view our comment history. That's public as well. So they could see the list of the files that we made comments on and then pull out the hashes and go and browse to that. So let's see. Is it playing up there? Maybe? Man, really? I was hoping that the video demos would go well. Let's try going out. All right, well, we might have to skip this demo. But effectively what the tool does is, just like what we said, packs a bunch of data in a sample, uploads it, waits for the analysis to finish, which can take a while, and then pulls back the data and validates that it matches. I didn't go full-blown interactive shell like the EWS one, primarily because I find this technique a bit more fun in games than it is legitimate. But if you wanted to take it and turn it into that, you're obviously welcome. All right, and it's with that we come into our cloud abuse and takeover realm. So this is kind of the final leg of our entire C2. And first, I'll establish in my mind what I mean when I say cloud. So cloud, very distributed, obviously tons of providers, but there's really four primary ones that represent the largest market share. Specifically, I'm gonna leave my items primarily focused on AWS, Azure, and a little bit of GCP. Together, they represent with Alibaba 84% of all of the cloud provider market. So I think it's probably what attackers are going to aim for anyways. There's a ton of functionality in the cloud, but I'm going to keep this talk focused on C2 primitives. We're not going to talk a lot about abusing AWS secret keys or anything like that, although that's obviously related. So I break down the cloud problem into two primary issues. One is we have trust boundary problems. The cloud represents sort of a break in our classic ideas of trust boundaries. And two, the assets that the cloud have are very dynamic, and the traditional protocols and the systems that we have in place now aren't set up to handle them effectively. So in terms of trust boundaries, once again, we have a client connecting to a server, and if we install a perimeter there, the perimeter can use some reference for a trust repository to say, well, this traffic is, or this particular endpoint is benign or it's malicious. But once we install cloud in there, it gets kind of complicated, right? Now we have traffic leaving our perimeter towards some generalized cloud domain, and we might be able to make some distinction of the traffic based on qualities of the domain or maybe the URL. But at the end of the day, these become really high complexity sitting on top of HTTP, things that we're not really ready to deal with. I'll give some examples if any of these domains look familiar, like Azure websites, Amazon AWS.com, probably one of the more popular ones, Akamai.net, or the popular CloudFront.net that was used for fronting. And the second half of our issue is, once again, dynamic assets. So we have trust problems, but also we have this problem with, how will TLS scale with the cloud? And we've actually already ran into this before. This is why SNI exists. So, before we just had a server and an IP and they were linked together like a domain name and everything was fine. Now we have front planes all over the world and we're like abusing DNS in a way to reduce effectively the transfer time or the round trip time to any particular server. But what that meant is that servers needed to break TLS or have some ability to look at TLS, which we'll talk about in just a second. The additional thing we're going to talk about is DNS. So DNS is kind of the protocol that hasn't taken the hit yet, but how does it deal with the reallocation of assets, the redistribution of assets to a particular agent or person? How can we represent ownership, and how can we prevent misconfiguration, especially when that misconfiguration is so isolated, when it's so easy to misconfigure cloud assets, and then on top of that, the cloud assets are so easy to look for because they're in just one spot on the internet. We have a serious problem with keeping people responsible for the assets they have control over. So this all came about in sort of the first round of cloud getting its punch in domain fronting, if anybody's heard of that. In a classic sense, we make some HTTP request to kittens.com, which resolves to a quick IP, effectively the closest server to us. We'll call it 1234. SNI happens where we effectively tell the server, hey, we're looking for kittens.com, by the way. But the GET request is made against that server with the host header set to azureedge.net. Then we might go to puppies.com, and the same process happens again, and you'll note the bottom request is effectively the same. We're making the same request to the same server, and the only thing that changes is the host header. So attackers obviously figured out how to abuse this by making a web request to one host, kittens.com. When that packet or when that request leaves the network, it gets put in the web logs as kittens.com. But we forge the host header to puppies.azure.net. And the DNS resolution happens the same way. Ultimately, at the end of it, we get to connect to a website that the perimeter never thought we were connecting to. And once again, these are the intricacies of the protocol that I'm talking about. We never assumed that a host header could make that much difference in terms of the website content that you load, but it does now. An IP means nothing. It's just an IP on a cloud front plane somewhere. So in terms of abuse, beyond domain fronting, or sort of what's next, file hosting, we can host static payloads in containers. That's been demonstrated before, as well as shoveling dynamic data via those same containers. So in AWS, these look like S3 buckets. GCP has its cloud storage with sort of the same terminology. And Azure has blob storage. It's kind of got a bunch of nuances to it, but generally the links look like SAS links, and they're a little bit larger. But I will have you note that the bucket ID can actually go two different places depending on how you load it. So you can have the bucket ID that is specific to you get put into the DNS name, or you can have the bucket name get put into the URL. And I think a lot of people maybe assume that, well, we could detect you using an S3 bucket because it identifies you. It says my bucket, Mr. Evil bucket.s3.amazon AWS. But if your web gateway isn't prepared to extract the bucket name from the URL, then how would you know the difference between any s3.amazon.aws link and another? We can also look at serverless code. So, pass-through traffic redirection was a big part of domain fronting for the Google Cloud Platform specifically. So this is where we have, some code that gets loaded into an engine, and when we receive a web request, we just forward that request on. App engines look like AppSpot URLs, and Lambda obviously has the unique IDs .execute APIs. I think, just once again, an important thing to extract is how many people are looking for these? How many people are even familiar with what these URLs look like? If a SIM analyst saw these URLs in a log, would they know the difference between one particular Azure website's URL or an AppSpot URL, or even an AMSA or an AWS Lambda endpoint? And it's with that I want to get into the takeover primitives. So this is really my attack on DNS in a way. Once again, TLS has had its beating in terms of SNI and having to deal with dynamic cloud infrastructure. And now we're looking at the way that DNS has sort of hanging records that get left out. The orphaned record scene is becoming pretty intense. At any given time, an organization now has to maybe manage 100 domain names or hundreds of domain names or even thousands in a records file. And those records are static. They just get implemented and they point to a cloud asset, but that asset's now very dynamic. There's been a ton of research in this area. Patrick Huduk, if you're in here, I'm very sorry if I ruined your name. He actually did an entire thesis paper on the analysis of DNS in cybersecurity. He also has the second link down, the AWS Route 3 or Route 53 name server takeovers. If any of you guys haven't read this stuff, you definitely should. These people have been screaming this for ages, like these cloud providers are vulnerable to like thousands of domains being taken over. And it really is the truth. These DNS records are not prepped to handle this sort of stuff. Generally, when I started looking at the DNS takeover, I started organizing it into two primary schools of thought. So one is you would go after a CNAME record. CNAME records might commonly be used in bug bounty programs where you're trying to identify a URL or a domain that points to, say, GitHub, where they've since removed their GitHub account. These are frequently called subdomain takeovers, although I think what I'll show actually opens up the idea that subdomain takeover could mean something different. The alternative is going after name server records. So if you were interested in taking over an entire domain, that's sort of where the Route 53 research comes in. But what about others? I started asking myself, is there any way for us to target IP-based records instead of domain name records that point to other domain names? So I came up with two problems that we kind of have to solve before we go into this. One is, how quickly could we actually collect new addresses? It's kind of a big problem, right? It's like, beforehand, you would have to go to a VPS provider and buy a server, and maybe they would give you one address, and you had to like claw at them to give you a second address, and maybe like pay more money. And now cloud providers are like, man, there's an API endpoint for it. You guys cycle that thing, multi-threaded, 10 threads a minute. And the second question is, how would we accurately check for any orphan record? This is actually the larger problem in the scheme of things. DNS doesn't really work the same way backwards, so we're trying to find hanging orphaned records from an IP address, and there's not a lot of great repositories for this. But here's the concept. So the concept is we would communicate with some cloud provider and we collect a random IP. That IP is now ours. The cloud provider just gave it to us. We own it, it belongs to us, and now what we have to find out is that record interesting? If we go to a particular records authority or some sort of DNS record repository and say, is a DNS name associated with this IP? And they say yes, well then perfect. We can now sort of keep the IP and use that DNS name. The DNS will resolve, it goes through a zone file that we don't even own, and we just hope that that record stays alive for as long as possible. And we'd probably just repeat this process for as many records as we wanted or to handle failure conditions. So about this record repository, we can't really use pointer records. That's kind of the idea of reversing a DNS IP. But there's a problem with that in that they're not necessarily accurate. They probably point to a domain record that belongs to like the provider that hosts the infrastructure. It doesn't really point to the true domain that we would be interested in. Rapid7 has a great project called OpenDNS that has a bunch of data repositories for A records and MX records. You could definitely use that. The JSON files are massive, so you'd have to figure out a way to parse them. But that's probably one of the routes I would go long term. 3 would be getting access to the top-level zone file. I actually went through this process. It's not too hard. VeriSign is charged with keeping the global top-level zone file that effectively shows all of the domains that exist in the .com namespace and the name servers that handle those domains. So this is more relevant to the name server takeover, but if you are looking at that sort of strategy, and I think the blog before about the 120,000 domain name takeovers used that top-level file. There is a public database, the Whois XML. Well, it's not public, it's private, but it's paid, and you can find it on their website. They don't really post a price for that. I never inquired. I don't really know what they would charge to get access to that database or if they provide an API. Luckily, though, the folks at Security Trails have sort of helped us out here. This is a new website that is just what we need. It's a repository of DNS information, and they provide APIs, and we can query all sorts of stuff from it. So with that, we have the final piece to the puzzle, and I'm sort of releasing today a thing I'm calling Cloud Raccoon, because it's digging through the trash of the internet. But it hunts for IPs linked to orphan DNS records, and it uses cloud IPs for the fast cycling bit. Now, this varies depending on provider. I found AWS to be clearly the best. It's superior not only in the speed at which you can request IPs, but also the fact that the Azure or the AWS network space has been around a lot longer, so there's just more DNS records pointing to that space. Azure is pretty good. It's slow. I think you can multi-thread it out. I'm not sure if I tried that. And GCP pulls things from a pool. It's a bit weird. It's like they carry a pool forward. So if you continually request IPs, at some point you'll start to get the same IPs back. So the script I wrote to do it effectively tracks that, and it'll target a particular percentage of IPs at which it feels like it's seen enough of them before it gives up. And then you just sort of wait a day and try again. But we'll hope that this video plays. Excellent. Cool. So obviously I recorded this. I actually recorded this in the Lyft ride over here. But this is it hunting through AWS, so it's pulling IPs. The first IP it saw was not good enough, so you can set up whitelists and all that. It's effectively letting you know that it saw it, but it gave it up. And it's continually searching. Eventually here it should hit another record for, I don't know, some top-level server. It's kind of soothing. Nice, I could feel your guys' excitement. You wanted it to happen so bad. But anyways, now we effectively have an IP with a domain record that is a Splunk server, or at some point they had a Splunk instance. This is a proof of concept, but this is actually a bit unique in comparison to the other two projects in that operationally we've been using this for about 6 to 8 months. all of our production infrastructure uses this strategy, and we just cycle IPs. We have 20 of them at this point, and we use them for real-world operations. So I would be surprised if this isn't being performed by real-world actors at this point. But you can get top-level domains for some crazy things. We found antivirus vendors, we found research institutes, government agencies. Obviously, you'll hear the same thing echoed in the blogs I posted about these takeover primitives. But this is extremely accessible. Like I said, this is not contrived at all. This is literally the first run in the lift right over here. If we sat here and ran them, I bet you we would have 10 or 15 in a 5-minute period. So some final thoughts. I think the key points to take away from this talk is C2 is a very complex discipline. The implementations vary greatly, and not always for great reasons, but usually the particular design decisions aren't random. These people are choosing HTTP for reasons, they're choosing ICMP for reasons. I think the more we can understand that C2 is a discipline that has been crafted over a long time and people are sort of in these molds now, the better able we're going to be able to handle the changes coming soon. There's a ton of public research already available. That's really one thing I wanted to point out in this talk is, I didn't come here to show off my proof of concepts and say that, oh, they're so awesome, you guys should only use those. But the reality situation is people have been releasing these for years, and I don't really feel like they're getting the credit they deserve. I think it's because people think it's still theoretical or it's not really easy to operationalize. But I think we need to start solving these new problems. I think domain fronting was just the first crack in a long series of cracks, and this DNS takeover thing is going to be the next. Third-party abuse is growing, and cloud is representing some very unique challenges for us. So next, I just want to cover what wasn't covered. I'm a guy who likes to give information. I didn't touch at all about offensive infrastructure, which is its own discipline, but related discipline. This would include like asset collection, traffic redirection, stage segmentation. There are a bunch of great people who I'll post links to that give this sort of stuff out for free and give you all the resources you need for it. But really, all of these individual primitives can't work without that knowledge either. So, that's really where I think people lose the connection is they can see, okay, yeah, I use VirusTotal for C2, but how would I actually build it? The second is the specific architecture details, so like language choice, the details surrounding encoding or encryption, sort of the deep complexities. Obviously, the source code will be in your hands, so if you want to take a look at it. But also the implementation costs as well. None of this stuff is free. I'll post some additional resources. So, Zaria Labs has a good blog sort of detailing a bunch of basic C2. MITRE ATT&CK Framework, they have a documented wiki of a bunch of, different samples and all of the C2 styles that they used. I use that a lot for referencing material in this presentation. Blue Screen of Jeff has an amazing Red Team infrastructure wiki that actually has many of the links I've put in the slideshow on there as well. So if you were to visit one link after this presentation, it should be that link. There's domain fronting lists and also a bunch of tools for subdomain takeover, in the classic sense where you're looking for CNAME records that are abusable. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I actually finished a little early, which is pretty good. My Twitter handle's up there, and honestly, as you couldn't tell by me recording demos in the car ride on the way over here, I will upload code soon, probably tonight, but I couldn't. If you want to just monitor my GitHub, they'll probably be under there as like, github.com/addendum, something like that. And I guess I want to open the floor for any questions people have. I'm told to tell you there are microphones if you guys want to line up on the microphones or.
You were saying that when you were polling the GCP address spaces, it caused it to retain the pool. Mm-hmm. Could you maybe use that as a denial of service and basically force it to never give up pools?
So yeah, that's kind of interesting. I'm not really sure what their backend looks like. That might be a possibility. My assumption is that they're effectively designing a floating pool for almost a caching reason. For anybody who didn't hear, his question was effectively, in GCP, what does the pool mech really mean, and could it be used for a denial of service? I would assume that they would just expand the pool as necessary. There's also account limitations. So by default, Google Cloud Platform only lets you have a certain number of IPs at a time. The same thing goes for AWS and Azure. You can boost those quotas, but I'd be surprised if the quotas ever exceeded the pool.
Yeah, do you see any advantage to adopting HTTP 3, which is based on UDP instead of TCP?
Oh, you know what? Honestly, I'm not that familiar with it. I can't think of any, but I also don't want to say the opposite either. Oh. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.